Good morning, and welcome to our online community here at Welcome Wesleyan. We are so thankful that you've joined our live stream this morning. My name is Ethan, I'm the worship pastor here, and I am so glad that you've tuned in. Welcome Wesleyan is dedicated to outreach, hospitality, biblical teachings, and encountering God through worship. We hope that through our online community you can experience all of these. If you are new with us, we are so glad that you've joined us this morning. If you want to stay up to date with our channel and be notified when we are live, click the subscribe button below, along with the bell icon right next to it. For those of you who are returning to our ministries and would like to give to them, you can go to welcomewesleyan.com, open the menu, and click on Give. There you can give your tithes and offerings through our website. And finally, if you would like to leave your questions and comments throughout the stream, please feel free to do so in chat. We are so glad you're with us, and we hope you enjoy the service.
Scripture today is from Exodus chapter 1. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Exodus 1:8-21.
5th and 6th graders are now dismissed to the youth group.
We want to thank you, team, for leading us in worship today. It's just a beautiful thing, isn't it, to lift up our praise to God and to worship Him. Just a couple of things real quick I want to mention. Next Sunday is Tad's last day with us as a resident. We have just so much appreciated Tad. In fact, Tad, come on up. Just a second. Yeah, right. There you go. Don't you love this guy? Yeah, you've done so much, and Tad has been leading all the worship over the traditional, and then you run over here, and then you play keyboards and all kinds of things here. I just want to say, we just really, really appreciate you. And so anyway, next Sunday is going to be his last Sunday here with us, so just be sure you show your appreciation to Tad. One more time, let's give him a big round. Also, Andrea Summers is with us today. Professor Summers teaches at Southern Wesleyan University. She's a colleague of mine. She is so beloved by the students, and I know your heart is going to be really inspired by what she has to say. Andrea, a few years ago, was the leader over all women's ministry for the entire Wesleyan Church, and we are just so privileged to have her at Southern Wesleyan. She's an excellent professor and a great woman of God. Let's just welcome her. Let's give a warm welcome to Andrea Summers.
Yep, like I said, usually my fault. It's good to be here this morning. Okay, I'm ready now. Yeah, I love being at Indiana. Let me start over again. I love being at Southern Wesleyan. I graduated from Indiana Wesleyan, but I love the students there. I love what I get to do there. I have a husband, Jeremy. We have 4 children. And, it's interesting because when Jeremy and I were expecting our first child, first pregnancy, I thought to myself, how hard can this be? Really. I mean, I hear it's difficult, and I'm sure it's very painful, but women have been doing this since the dawn of time, right? This is not a new thing. Surely I'm not any more special than any other woman who has gone through this and who has had a baby. What is the big deal? Okay, so I see some of the women out there who have actually given birth smiling at me like, So I got there, and I'm telling you what, I was completely unprepared. I'm so grateful by God's grace on the other side of it. We had this beautiful, healthy, amazing, wonderful baby girl. But I'm not going to lie, the experience was kind of traumatic. And so when Jeremy and I, a couple years later, were expecting for our second child, I was like, oh, this is going to be different. Yeah, and so I was sure that I was going to plan this out. I was going to have this all figured out. We went with a midwife for our second pregnancy. And I remember getting close to the due date, and I sat down in the office of my midwife, and I handed her my birth plan. You guys know what a birth plan is? For me, it was 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that had all the things that were going to happen. When I want this to happen, I want this to happen, I want this, I do not want this to happen, I do not want this to happen. And I handed it to my midwife. I was very proud of it. I'd worked very hard on it. How do you think my midwife responded? She did not giggle like many of you were doing, thankfully. But I was kind of miffed. I was kind of put off by her response. She glanced at it, and then she heaved a deep sigh. And Beth, my midwife, who had been with me for the last about 7 months. And she's a 36-year-old woman, younger than I am now, but she would shuffle into my office with a cane like a 100-year-old woman. And she was so wonderful, she was so gentle, she was so good. And then she would get her cane and she would shuffle back out again. And I knew she was sick, but I mean, the reality is that I'm the patient, she's not, so I didn't really know what was going on in her life. But here she is, and she sits across from me, she hands me the piece of paper back again. And she leans forward and she says, you know, this is fine, this is good, but you have to be prepared for the fact that things are not going to go according to plan. Things are not going to go according to plan. And then she said something. She said, it's going to be hard. It's going to be messy. It's going to be painful. But it's going to be good. And it's going to be worth it. And she was done. She got up. She got her cane. She shuffled out, just kind of leaving me going, but do you want this though? Like, shouldn't you be keeping this? And I think that this passage that was read so beautifully for us a few minutes ago, there is something that these two Hebrew midwives in this passage know that my midwife, Beth, knew. That it's not just about bringing babies into the world, but there's something about being a midwife for the soul. And these two Hebrew midwives in this passage, there's more than just babies being birthed here. There's two kinds of births happening in this passage in Exodus 1. Yes, there is a generation of Hebrew babies being born, and they're midwifing them in. This is the generation. It's actually a really important generation. This is the generation that actually goes from babies, they grow up to become adults, and they're the ones who paint their doorposts with blood. They're the ones who walk across the Red Sea on dry land. They are the ones it was Aaron that was birthed in this generation, Moses' older brother, who was that steady prophetic voice for Moses, who actually was the first priest of Israel and established worship for the nation of Israel. And these two midwives, Sifra and Pua are their names. If you're making baby lists, I encourage you to add them to the list. They don't get used a lot, and I'm not sure why, Sifra and Pua. But they're these two midwives who they were the first ones to welcome this generation, this important generation of Hebrew babies into the world. And they were the first ones to kind of hold them up and hear them cry their first cry. So there's a whole generation being birthed here, but there's something else that's being birthed in this passage if we're really paying attention. That these two midwives birthed the future of Israel. This nation, this Israelite nation that God had promised would be blessed in order to be a blessing to the whole world. This was part of God's plan for salvation. And here is Israel. If we're paying attention to the story, we see that at this point in the story, man, Israel is hanging by a thread. They're hanging by a cord, an umbilical cord, if you will. That Pharaoh is trying to tamp these people down. He's trying to subjugate God's people. And these Hebrew midwives, they go around this oppressive power of Egypt, and they deliver another chance to the nation of Israel. They give them another chance. And I just imagine these two midwives, Sifra and Pua, like they were whispering the same thing that my midwife said. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be good. It's going to be worth it. And I want to suggest that just like so many of these Hebrew women who were pregnant with a new generation of promise, and just like this entire nation that is literally pregnant in this passage with the hope of Exodus, that every single one of us this morning is pregnant with promise, pregnant with possibility, that God is longing to birth something new in your life. Maybe that new thing that he wants to bring forward in your life, maybe it is a new understanding of faith. Maybe it is a freedom from fear. Maybe it is a new healing. Maybe it's a power to change. But God is growing something in you. God is growing something in me. And if we're paying attention to the wisdom of the midwives that we see right here in this passage in Exodus chapter 1, I think we can begin to maybe imagine God as a spiritual midwife. We can hear God coming alongside of us. We can hear God whispering to us, it's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. But it's going to be good. It's going to be worth it. And this is language that Paul used when he was writing to the Galatians. He says in Galatians 4:19, "My dear children, for whom I'm again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you." I mean, Paul has this sense here that he gets to be a part of bringing out this new life in the lives of the Galatians. He gets this, and he also knows that it is something that is painful. He calls them the pains of childbirth. He knows it's painful. He knows it is messy. He knows that it's grueling. He knows that sometimes it's long. And I think sometimes, I know I do, when I'm in the middle of that, I just want God to reach in and just rescue me. Hey, God, can you be that rescuing God? Yes, did God rescue the people from Egypt? Yes, he did. But it was long and painful and grueling for us. And this is the part of the story we're looking at today. We want God to just pull us out and rescue us, and God's going, it's going to be hard. It's going to be good. It's going to be worth it. I think sometimes, man, we just give up. Too often we give up before God actually finishes growing and finishes bringing that new life into fruition. So the question this morning, the question that I want us to think about, to wrestle with here, is how do we commit ourselves to the process? How do we partner with God to bring something new into the world? How do we partner with God to bring something new in our own lives? Because God wants to bring something new. I think maybe it's in our lives, maybe even in this church right now. Maybe this church is pregnant with possibility. And God wants to bring forth something new. And you know, this account right here in Exodus that we're talking about today, I think that the lives of these midwives, they give us some clues that kind of help us answer that question. And I want to suggest that these Hebrew midwives give us 3 pieces of wisdom. And I want to talk about 3 pieces of wisdom that they get. First of all, these Hebrew midwives, they tell us to embrace the bitterness and the blessing. To embrace the bitterness and the blessing. Because here's the thing, the context for God birthing something new in you is the context of bitterness and blessing. I think so many times we think of our lives in terms of, good or bad, or happy or unhappy, or bitter and blessed. We like to kind of separate everything out nice and neat. But what is so much more often the case, especially when God is birthing something new, is that blessing shows up hand in hand with the bitter. That the very thing that God brings, that suffering that comes along sometimes, is the very vehicle that God uses to bless us. And that the very blessing that maybe comes along is also something that brings with it a sense of loss. And we see this here in Exodus, because the reality, Exodus 1, it picks up right where Genesis left off. Joseph becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man, right? I mean, Joseph is a hero. He has saved all of Egypt. He saved the Israelites from famine and from starvation. Pharaoh has put him in charge of everything in the kingdom. And God makes good on his covenant promises to Abraham. Remember when God told Abraham that I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. I will make you a great nation. He's doing it right here. If we look at verse 7 right here in Exodus chapter 1, listen to this. It says the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous the land was filled with them. And actually, if we keep reading in Exodus, we go all the way to chapter 13, where when they are actually leaving Egypt, they number 600,000 men. I mean, men and women and children. We're talking about over 1 million people. God is blessing the Israelites. God is making good on his promise to Abraham. These people are well on their way to becoming as numerous as the stars in the sky, right? God is fulfilling his Abrahamic promise. He is blessing them. But wherever there is blessing, we also see relentless evil come up against it. We see this in our lives. We see this right here in Exodus. And if we keep reading here in Exodus, we see that there is a new Pharaoh in town, right? And this guy does not remember, or he does not care about Joseph. He doesn't care that Joseph was Pharaoh's right-hand man. All he sees is these Israelite people, and they are this underclass of people. And so picking up in verse 13, the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So this new Pharaoh, he sees the Israelites, he sees how numerous they are, and he gets worried. He's like, okay, these guys, if our enemies attack, they can join with our enemies, they can obliterate us, and then all the Israelites are going to leave town, and then what are we left with? Like, we've lost our slave class. Who is going to be left to do all the menial labor? Who's going to do all the jobs that we don't want to do, all the dirty jobs? Who's going to do all the back-breaking toil that we don't want to do? And Pharaoh was scared. He was scared. I think it kept him up at night. And so as a means of control, Pharaoh comes along. His solution, his first solution was to put slave masters over them, to oppress them. Slave masters that would have been probably beating them and punishing them, oppressing them and giving them an even more grueling labor than they already had. He made their lives miserable, bitter. And this is the setting for God to birth something new. A new generation, a new fresh start for Israel. I want to suggest that this is so often also the setting that God uses to birth something new in our lives as well. That intertwining of bitter and blessed. Do you feel like you're living in the middle and that tension between bitter and blessed this morning? Some of you, yeah. Some of you are going, it's just all bitter, actually. I don't see any blessed. I'm guessing that some of those guys out in the fields doing that grueling labor probably didn't see a lot of blessed either from their perspective. What is your bitterness right now? What is that thing that makes your heart sink if you think about it? That unrealized longing, maybe. I think some of us have these longings that, a longing for purpose, or a longing to just be truly loved by someone else. A longing for a child. A longing for a prodigal child to come home. These unrealized longings are hard. There's real suffering. It's bitter. Maybe the thing that makes you feel that bitterness, makes your heart sink, is the feeling of rejection, where, you have put yourself out there and you were rejected. And whether it was yesterday or whether it was a year ago or longer, it still hurts. Or maybe that bitter feeling is just a feeling of being lost, where you look and you go, you know what, this wasn't the plan. How did I get here? Like, this wasn't how I thought my life was going to end up. And you just feel stuck. Anyone feel stuck this morning? Maybe the bitterness is just this sense of injustice, where you look at your life, or you look at lives of people around you and go, this isn't fair, this isn't right. But the wisdom of the midwives in this passage is that bitterness and blessing show up together. And when they do, it might actually be a sign of labor. It might be a forerunner to birthing something new in your life. It might be a sign that something new is growing, that if we've got blessing and bitterness, it means it's go time. It means it's time to roll up our sleeves. It means it's time to get in there, to start preparing the way for what it is that God wants to do, that we are pregnant with the beginnings of something new. And that God, even maybe this morning, is coming alongside us and he's saying, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's painful, but it's good, and it's worth it. Another piece of wisdom that I want to leave with you this morning, maybe from this passage right here in Exodus, the midwives, is to fear God, not Pharaoh. Fear God, not Pharaoh. It's right here in this passage, actually. I want you to listen for this word fear. As we read here, picking up in verse 15, it says, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. Shiphrah and Puah had an order, right? They were supposed to kill the Hebrew boys as soon as they were born. And that order came from the highest levels, quite frankly, the most powerful man in the world, right? And they had to make a choice. They could do their job. They could put their head down. They could participate in the unjust system. They could play their role or not. And it is incredible to me how difficult this was not a one-time decision for them, one and done. This was a decision that they had to make over and over and over again. I mean, think about it for a minute. I don't know about you. I see a 3-month-old baby, unless that child has a giant pink bow on their head, I cannot tell if it's a boy or a girl. Is it just me? Anyone ever put their foot in their mouth saying, oh, my youngest son, Ty, no one could tell whether he was a boy or a girl until he's all boy, by the way, but until he was about 3.5 years old, no one could tell. I think I have a picture of him, actually. And, I would take him places, and people would look at him and they would say, he's the prettiest little girl. I got to the point where I just didn't even, I was like, yes, thank you. And I know you guys are judging me because you're like, well, cut his hair. Maybe people won't think he's a girl if you cut his hair. But it's just so cute, I couldn't do it. But can you imagine, though? It wasn't like 2 or 3 days and all of a sudden Pharaoh's like, why are there so many Hebrew boys hanging around? No. It was probably months, maybe even years before all of a sudden Pharaoh would have realized. And so think of all the births that these women attended. Think of how many times they had to make that decision again. Do I fear God or do I fear Pharaoh? Am I going to do the right thing or not? They chose over and over again, day in and day out. How in the world were they able to have this much courage? How are they able to have such courage? And the clue to their courage, I want to suggest, is right here in verse 17, where it says, "But the midwives feared God." You got it. The midwives feared God. Have you ever considered that everybody in this equation is scared, is afraid, is dealing with fear? The midwives have a fear of God. Pharaoh is afraid of the people. Both are motivated by fear, but we're talking about two very different kinds of fear here, right? And that word, yare, in the Hebrew that's used for the fear of God that these midwives have, it's this fear in a very moral sense. It's to be in awe of, to have reverence for, to honor, to respect. This is the idea we have from the Hebrew midwives. But if you look at the word, right here, that not just Pharaoh, but all of the Egyptians, it says, it's translated in your Bible probably as the word dread, that they came to dread the Israelites. And this word means to cause to be anxious, to cause to be fearful, to have this growing feeling of sickening dread, right? And so isn't it interesting that Pharaoh's fear results in self-preservation, that the midwives' fear results in self-giving, that Pharaoh's fear has him all tied up in knots, unable to sleep at night probably. The midwives' fear results in the midwives having courage. Would you think it's okay if I switch to this one? Okay.
Can you hear me? So here are the midwives. Their fear brings them to this place of courage, actually. These are very different kinds of
Fear here. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Because if we fear God, we don't have anything else to fear. It's not that you're never going to feel anxious again or you're never going to feel worried again. I think we will, actually. But to fear God means you don't have to give your life over to that fear. It means you're ruled by this awe, this respect for God. A while back, I was in Zambia, and our team, we were there for a mission trip, our team took a day, and we went and we visited Victoria Falls. Anyone been to Victoria Falls in here? It is one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's this incredible waterfall. So we travel up this, tight path up the side of it, and we get to this point where we're literally overlooking the waterfalls, and the power of that water rushing over the side of that cliff and just dropping hundreds of feet down below was just incredible. And here we are on this precipice overlooking. There is no guardrail. There is no fence, nothing. And I'm the team leader, so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, one misstep, and somebody's like, we're going to plummet to our death. So I'm like holding everybody back. But it was this sense of being in this thin place, in this vulnerable place, where you go, wow, this is awesome, and this is scary. And I think that gets at maybe just a sliver of the kind of feeling that these midwives had for God when they said that they feared God. They go, man, God is scary awesome, right? God is scary awesome. Who is the Pharaoh in your life? Who are you trying to impress? Who has all the power? Because the midwives' secret in this is that they feared God. And because they feared God, they didn't have to fear anyone else. But their courage here, this fear of God that leads to courage, it's not just any kind of courage. And this is the third piece of wisdom I want to share this morning from the midwives, that creative courage finds a way. Creative courage just finds a way. This is a different kind of courage than the courage that we see with David, who, uses a slingshot and kills Goliath. That was incredible. That took courage. And, like Samson, who, takes care of an entire Philistine army single-handedly. That takes courage. But this kind of courage, this is this quiet, steady, subversive, creative courage that does the right thing over and over and over again. It's right here. It was picking up in verse 18. It says, "Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.'" They're basically like, "Look, Pharaoh, you see these Hebrew women are different than the Egyptian women. They're just so hardy. They're so tough. They're popping out babies before we can even get there." This isn't some sort of explanation where they're trying to buy themselves time or try to make excuses. They are protecting the Hebrew people. And there's some people that would say, well, they lied. Like, isn't that a sin? They're not telling the truth. Well, what would you do if you were in 1942 Germany and you were protecting some Jews and the Gestapo came to your door and said, "How many people are in this home?" This passage right here does not give us an excuse to spin the truth or to lie or to deceive, because we don't want to pay the cost of whatever it is that it costs to tell the truth. That's not what this is. This isn't self-serving. But I think that what we've got here is that if a genocidal maniac ever comes to you and asks you to exterminate an entire ethnic group of people, that this text might give you permission to get creative, right? To get creative, to be subversive, because courage finds a way. And the reality is that we live in a world that is unjust. We live in a culture that is unjust. It just is. And doing what's right means that you're not going to fit into the systems around you. You will not fit in. You're going to have to get uncomfortable. You are going to have to confront people who are powerful. You're going to have to live differently than the people around you. You're going to have to stick your neck out. You're going to have to walk into uncharted territories. You're going to have to allow creative courage to find a way. It's not going to look like it always has for you. If God is birthing something new in you, or if God is birthing something new even in this church, guess what? It's not going to look like it always has. It's going to look different. The way that you've always done it is not going to work anymore. And you are going to have to lean into creative courage. I sat across from Beth, my midwife, in that office that day, and I was a little annoyed that she didn't think that my birth plan was as great as I thought it was. But when it actually came time to give birth to our second child, her words of wisdom were indispensable to me. And a few months after Ava was born, I got news that Beth had died. And I knew she wasn't well, but that she had passed away, that she had actually been dying for a long time of ovarian cancer. That 12 hours before she slipped into a coma, she had delivered her last baby, welcomed her last life into the world. Up until the very end, she was still welcoming life into the world. And I go back sometimes to that moment in the office, and I think, man, her words to me were coming from a life that knew the tension between bitterness and blessing, right? Her words words to me came from a life that knew what it meant to fear God. Her words to me came from a life that knew that the way of birthing something new in our lives is creative courage, that it means fearing God more than fearing what other people might think. And so I wonder if God is saying to us this morning, it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. But take courage. It's going to be good. It's going to be worth it. Oh God, what are you growing inside of us today? What new life are you bringing forward? Help us to see the bitterness as signs of labor. Help us to have an awe and a respect and to see you for the scary, awesome God that you are. Help us to fear you more than fear what others think. Help us to see that the way of you bringing about something new in our lives is a way of creative courage. Help us to have an imagination for what you want to do in us, in this community, in this church. In your name.
They
Thank you so much for joining our services today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat, as it will remain open for a few more minutes. If you would like to reach us after the stream concludes, you can go to welcomewesleyan.com, scroll all the way to the bottom of our homepage, and there you'll find a form that you can use to contact us. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching for Welcome Wesleyan. We are so grateful that you have joined us today, and we hope you have a wonderful week.